great to see everyone here this afternoon. This is the second of 7 workshops on AI that we're running this semester. So myself and Nadine have kind of organised the suite of workshops, and the first 2 are on AI basics. So I'm delighted that Mike O'D from Computer Sciences is leading the first 2 sessions. Just to give you a little bit of context, so apologies for those who were there, who came to the first one. All the sessions are recorded, so feel free to look at the recordings and we'll circulate them afterwards. But just in terms of the background for this, myself and Nadine were thinking about, Nadine was looking at it from a programme perspective, I was thinking about it with kind of Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning with Enrico, that kind of hat on, thinking how do we support colleagues in the context of this new paradigm around AI, and there is this kind of institutional policy around AI that challenges or mentions that staff should be up to date with AI and therefore incorporate it into our teaching, and kind of we're thinking, well, it's quite a grand challenge, how do we do that? And there's lots of AI literacy frameworks out there. We've adopted Helia's framework, which we thought was great in terms of organising these sessions. And, you know, it's not kind of a steady progress from 1 to 5, but essentially what Helia is saying is that, you know, if we're going to integrate AI into our learning and teaching, then we really need, before we can even think about that, we need to know kind of how AI works, think about kind of the mechanics of AI, and then it's not just about how we are teaching, but what we are teaching. So thinking about kind of like external inputs, what are employers looking for, what are the external factors that impact both what we teach and how we teach. And once we've got those skills, then we can critically evaluate our own teaching. So we're kind of on that journey, and we're on the journey in terms of we're on the second workshop that's looking at AI basics. So we're kind of today we're going to be looking more at the tools, but thinking about kind of the pitfalls of the tools, looking at biases, looking at kind of potential problems that students might face. We spoke a lot in the last workshop around we don't mind students using AI, but we are worried that students might kind of fall into a trap, if you like, or things could go horribly wrong in that for their learning, and the students could be left with kind of some horrible surprises at the end of modules or at the end of a particular learning experience. So just to give you a kind of overview of the workshop series, I'm not going to go, this is all kind of on the invite. I just wanted to point out the ones that are in blue, 3 and 5, are events where you need to sign up via Eventbrite, so it's not just the Google Calendar. They're events where we've got external speakers coming in and we've got external audience. So if you want to come to those, which you're very, very welcome, just make sure you do sign up via Eventbrite. To make sure we get the sessions right, and also to acknowledge that some colleagues may want to use this as evidence of CPD. If you do attend more than 4 workshops, then you'll get a recognition of that via a certificate. So, you know, some people want to evidence their CPD, so we will be doing that. And then finally, so myself and Nadine can adjust or amend these workshops to meet your needs. If you didn't come to the last one, there is a workshop questionnaire. It's optional, but I really appreciate it if you haven't filled it in. You would fill in that questionnaire. There's a link to it. It's a Google form. We'll circulate it afterwards as well. But if you haven't done it, then we'd really appreciate you filling that in. So you're all very welcome. It's nice to see people within SBS and across the faculty, which is great. I'm going to hand over to Mike, who knows a lot more about this than me, so I'll hand you over to Mike.
Thanks, Caroline. Hi, everyone. Nice to see lots of faces again. I will just go back a couple of slides and just sort of say how today's session is fitting in. So today I'm really going to be focusing on 1 and 5. So I know that the order is the wrong way round for the framework, but actually, in fact, I'm working from a different framework that puts it in that order. So I kind of concentrated on these last workshop, and now more on these 2 areas today. So hopefully just giving you a sort of a foundation for the five stages of the AI literacy framework. So the details of what I'm looking at are this. And there's two key concepts that I want to introduce you to if you haven't, or if you don't already know about them, or just maybe if you do know, then fill in a little bit of the gaps, or if you already know a lot about it, please just humour me. Okay? And this is the idea of FATE, which is an acronym for Fairness, Accountability, Transparency and Ethics, which we apply to responsible use of AI. And then this idea of the post-plagiarism world. So the idea of taking into account what GenAI is, how it's integrated and incorporated in what we do, and then potentially what the world should or may look like once it's embedded within our learning and teaching. Okay, so those are the two sort of newish concepts, hopefully, for you. And then I've got a few case studies to show you how and people who I know have embedded AI in their assessments, or their learning and teaching. And then finally, I've got a workshop for you to maybe discuss, toss around some of these concepts and see how they would work, affect your learning and teaching practice. Okay? So, FATE started off in computer science as a set of principles for developing AI. So it was mainly with programmers, software engineers, companies, in terms of, and most of the time the big corporations have simply ignored it, but it is a set of principles. Microsoft and KPMG are two major players in terms of putting forward quite how they incorporate into their day-to-day practice. Not so sure about, but the concept of it is that it's a way of embedding ethical considerations within the way that AI has been developed and the way that it's applied. Before I go on to that, I just thought I wanted to clear up a couple of things from the last session that people asked me. Firstly, in terms of IP, what's the legal situation with regards to AI output? And I thought this was an appropriate place to put it in ethics. And from what I can see, it's this. In terms of patents, AI cannot be an inventor of a patent. So as the legal document or the legal advice that I've seen on the internet says, you can't patent AI stuff, output. Right? Copyright, though, is unclear, and it's different. The interpretations of it are different in the US to the UK. Essentially, though, the law says that the AI provider has copyright. In other words, the law says it's OpenAI, Gemini, Llama, Bard, in other words, the big corporations. They say in their terms and conditions, they turn copyright over to the users. But this hasn't been tested in court. The UK is slightly different. And they will only allow copyright if they consider there is sufficient human authorship. But they don't define what sufficient human authorship is. So even at this stage, the legal situation with regards to IP is unclear. And this here, that website there, if you want any more details, go to there. It's got a lot more information than I put on this slide. In terms of University of York, last week we talked about Gemini, and I was comfortable that Gemini was behind what we call a firewall. In other words, the information that you put into it, although it is open within University of York, it isn't then spilled outside. And the situation with Copilot is the same. I got IT support to confirm that. So what they said is essentially data entered into Copilot is not used by Microsoft to train its models. So again, it is open after a fashion within the university, but it is not open or visible outside Copilot and Gemini. So I thought I'd clear that up just because they were hanging around from last session. So, FATE. This is from education technology in terms of, it's an older diagram, or it's a more comprehensive diagram, showing all the ethical issues related to AI and the use of AI within education. And we can see there are aspects of safety, privacy, security, which we sort of covered, but the main thing is that you can see fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. Okay, and I did notice the typo there for equality. So there are these 4 key things that in computer science we are focused on, acknowledging that reliability and safety, privacy, security are also important, but they, in my opinion, come in underneath things like accountability and so on. So for the next couple of slides, I want to sort of take you through those and explain in a little bit more detail about what is meant by them. And more importantly, how we as educators can interpret them, because they weren't developed for us. They were developed for software engineers and computer scientists, technologists creating AI, as opposed to us using it. So, fairness. I hope now we all know about biases, about hallucinations, about the problems with AI algorithms, and also about the fact that we don't necessarily know where those biases come from and what they are until sometimes too late. However, what fairness also is in terms of where we are, it's about access to AI. Now, I'm pleased here at the University of York that we have bought for our students' use and staff use Gemini and Copilot, because it means then that we don't have a 2-tiered system of those who can afford it, access to the better quality, the newer software, compared to those that can't. However, there's more than that. That's what most people think about it, but there's more than that. So there was a recent study last year where they looked at students at universities in London and their use of AI. And what they found was that different groups of students use AI differently for different purposes. Some of the biggest users were, unsurprisingly, international students. And what they were using it for were things like translation, spell checking, grammar checking. What they did find in this survey was that most students weren't wanting to cheat. And most students were very scared about using AI because they weren't clear what the boundaries were, what was acceptable and what was not. But what they found was that international students were using AI a lot for those kind of activities. Whether you consider that cheating or not, that depends on your perspective. But that's what they were using it for. They also found that students with significant responsibilities outside of their work, such as caring, such as childcare, were also heavy users of AI. And they were using it as well. The automation ability for AI to help them with their time constraints to achieve what they needed to do. So again, from different perspectives, that may or may not be what you would consider to be cheating. And The other area were, and I've forgotten now, but I think it was students with disabilities who were also using it for things like interpreting, translating from text to voice and things like that. So again, the access and fair use is not just about access and fair use to the technology, it's also how they're using it. And what this, I think, was found was that, in my opinion, students using it for that is not downright cheating. They're using it to help them, yes, but they're using it to help them in a situation where they are disadvantaged. So, in terms of fairness, Gen AI can help us towards fairness if we understand what the issues are and if we understand how it's being used. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but it's also putting those students into a position of vulnerability, I think, because, you know, if they become over-dependent on it, or, you know, if their understanding of what is fair use and the person who's marking the understanding of fair use are different, then they've, you know, that's problematic.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. They don't know at this stage what fair use is. They don't know what acceptable use is. And it's up to us to put in place measures where it's clear to them. Because one thing that also came through from this report is that it's stressful for them. Yeah. Because they're using it for what to mainly, I mean, not all of them, there are always going to be students who cheat, but for most of them, they're not using it to cheat, but yet they wonder whether they are.
And there are students who fall into those categories who don't use it for that reason, and then they're doubly disadvantaged.
Exactly. So that then brings us on to accountability. Okay, so as part of accountability in software engineering, computer science, it's about disclosure. Right? It's about, and it's something that we're very poor at. In education, I think it's about acknowledgement and disclosure. And we need to encourage our students to acknowledge what they are doing and not be scared of disclosing certain activities, such as if you're using it to translate and English is your second, third or fourth language. Ali?
Just adding on to that, because of the direction of travel of a lot of the AI is now becoming agents and use of agents, a lot of it's now becoming embedded.
That's right.
So if you buy a Samsung now, you've got AI whether you want it or not, and whatever it does. And Microsoft are embedding everything, and everyone's embedding everything. So the idea of acknowledgement now becomes quite difficult, because as we get more and more agents that are embedded into everything, it gets harder and harder for students to be able to differentiate whether the output that they're creating is AI assisted or not, especially if they're embedded in a device like their phones. Most people haven't got a clue how to use their phones. They use about 25% of the capability of their phone anyway. So the idea that it's embedded, I mean, you all have this experience, right? You're writing an email and somebody decides to give you a sentence, how to finish it off. It says, I recommend this sentence at the end of this email. That embeddedness is something they may not be able to acknowledge, because if they're undergraduate especially, they've grown up with it. It's part of who they are. So it's something we have to work on, really understanding what acknowledgement would be, because the awareness isn't really there in the technology of the actual students to understand what they're doing with that software, whether it is AI or it is agentic AI or it's just something else.
Yeah, exactly.
Question, do you want to get online? The colleagues online have said, can we rephrase questions that are asked, or recap on questions that have been asked? They can't hear the questions when they've been asked from the audience.
Yeah.
So if you can just play it back.
Okay. Yeah.
And they can hear.
I've forgotten what the last question was, sorry.
It's more of a statement. I wouldn't worry,
Yeah.
but just in future it's a bit more of a statement, I think.
Okay. Can you hold that just for a couple more slides? So we need to help our students disclose. We need to provide the ability for AI use in education to be transparent. So in computer science, software engineering, it's about our algorithms. And I think last week I talked about how neural networks, and particularly the large language models, are extremely opaque. And in fact, even the programmers don't know what is being weighted, which are the most important inputs in terms of the outputs. In some of the older ones, we can figure it out. We also need to do that for our students, as Ali said, because everything is increasingly become embedded. Copilot is now side by side with Bing. And you don't know whether Copilot has taken over from your prompt or not. So we talked about assessment scales. I introduced you to the assessment scale last week, and I know that, and I keep saying, I keep pre-publicizing Nadine's AI assessment scale. That's one way of helping students to acknowledge. Firstly, we can set the rules. AI is not allowed for this assessment, and that's clear. AI is completely allowed. AI is allowed for this, that, and the other. AI is allowed for these aspects, but not that. Okay? So the AI assessment scales help students not acknowledge, but certainly understand their use. But I think we need to go one step further. So I'm not sure if any of you are aware of the credit taxonomy for, yes, you're all aware of it, for research papers, so which I have. Sorry, I have it on another screen, but I don't know this system, so I can't. But the credit taxonomy is a list of 14 activities or types of activities which you can contribute to on a research paper. And it covers things like ideation, writing, editing, managing, checking, and so on. And I think that what is missing is an AI version. So a taxonomy of AI use that we can then put side by side with AI assessment framework to say, this is what's allowed, and also now you can disclose what you've done. And you don't have to disclose in a very bland, very general statement, I used AI, or I used AI for this, because someone else would be using exactly the same AI, but express it in a different way. So I think when we have the scales and the credit taxonomy, then we have both elements of what we need to make it clear, to make it transparent, what our students are allowed to do and what they are doing. So I think this is the missing bit. And then finally, ethics, which covers a lot of those other things. And I'm not going to go into the details of the individual aspects of ethics, otherwise we'd still be here in 5 hours' time, if you hadn't all died of boredom and gone home. But what we should do is ethics should be part of our AI literacy. And it should be explicit. And it should be thought of at the beginning of any exercise. And there are many ways of doing it, but I quite like this one, this diagram. Not because here that it actually classifies students as criminals and chancers, but because of this framework, that it does highlight certain things, like it puts explicitly what the public and institutional risks are for use or misuse. It puts the emotional and the financial stresses in the diagram. It shows where academic integrity guidelines help us and where assessment security becomes an issue. And so I think this is a nice way of framing where our principles, where our ethics procedures, where our academic misconduct procedures and processes fit in. And what we'd all like is for everything to be down here. But then I think what this diagram shows is what we need to do where use or abuse or misuse of AI occurs in our assessment. So again, it's another clarification, it's another tool to make, what's the right word I'm looking for? To place within context our AI use. Does that make sense as well? Okay, and this is where you can find it here. This is from Ellison Murdoch. But I can't. So that was my sort of introduction to FATE and my sort of take on how FATE can be adapted and applied to our learning and teaching. Before I move on to the next bit, are there any questions? Everyone comfortable with the tack I was taking on that? All right, so if we then assume that we, at some point, and hopefully not too far in the future, have a clear AI environment, context within which we are working and within which our students are comfortable and knowledgeable of working with, then potentially we move into this what's called the post-plagiarism world, which is a turning on its head the way that we think about our assessments and our learning and teaching. And essentially what it is this. At some point, we will almost certainly have to acknowledge that AI and Gen AI in particular is part and parcel of our and our students' everyday activities, and it's part and parcel of their learning process too, and will become part and parcel of our teaching process. And it isn't just confined to AI, because we will be getting along new technology, brain chip implants and things like that, which potentially as well have the same disruptive or similar disruptive effects to Gen AI. So this lady at University of Calgary has a lot to say about it. She's got some really good ideas, so I'd point you towards her. And this is her nice diagram of, sorry, when I was reading it on my screen, it looked nice and clear, but I realize that it's not as clear as I thought it would be. So if I take you through it, humans can relinquish control, attribution remains important, language barriers are overcome. That's kind of we've already covered that in FATE. So FATE is essentially our ethics context within which post-plagiarism operates. The idea is that the end result is that human creativity is enhanced as opposed to replaced, which is the ideal. How far the balance goes, that depends really on what we do over the next short period, I would have thought. But for us, it's these two in learning and teaching that I think are important for us to realize will be changed sooner rather than later, in my opinion. Human AI writing will be normal. The argument in education is that certainly there are going to be exercises where it shouldn't be, but there are others where we go on as students become more and more competent, as students become further in their studies, where it probably is inevitable and probably is positive. And in that respect, then, as a result of that, this needs to change, the definition of plagiarism.
So Mike, that means that our current legal framework is just not fit for purpose. Because if the UK copyright law is indicating that there needs to be substantial human involvement, well, you can't differentiate that. We will get to a point soon where it will be very difficult to differentiate that.
Yes. But also, some people would argue, if we get it right, and we do have to think about these things now, if we get it right, then would it matter? Because the end output is this: human creativity is enhanced. And certainly, I don't know about you being in business schools, you're probably closer to industry than I am in computer science. But my contacts in industry, I think as I mentioned before, last session, the way that they use AI, I'm worried because there isn't ethics in there. They're just, effectively, it's end justifies the means. And they're not worried about how they get there. What they're worried about is commercial advantage. And I think, as I said this before as well, it's part of our duty to educate our students so that when they do get into the workforce, they can also play a role in making sure that AI is ethically applied, ethically developed. But essentially, this is what the post-plagiarism world, at the moment, the consensus, or maybe not the consensus, but the majority of opinion is it's going to look something like this. This is what we're dealing with, and this is what the result for us is going to be. Does that chime with what you're seeing, where you are?
I think it kind of fundamentally changes how we assess students.
It
Or
does.
it forces that to happen, because if you can kind of if you can cut the process, if you like, there needs to be then a focus on assessing students' process rather than assessing students' output.
Yeah.
Because the output can be done by a machine, whereas the process still has to be a human interact. That's my understanding. So I think that the assessment then needs to really focus on the learning process.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, because if we don't teach them how to do that, we don't get that. What we get is the other way round.
That's the real danger.
Yeah. Ali?
Yeah, I'm seeing students definitely using it in a way that helps them be more creative. I'm seeing, especially with looking for literature and doing other things, I've seen them using semantic scholar and things like that to find better literature and better connections. On the output side, they're using a lot of AI to do nice presentations and sort of other things like that, which aren't necessarily essay writing, but they're really good ways of communicating. So there are a lot of tools out there that they can use to be able to be very creative when they didn't have the ability to be that creative. And the cost of doing that in terms of time and money is a lot lower now. So you're seeing some very nice things that are appearing. It's just that we haven't clarified whether they're allowed to or not. And so they're a little bit terrified about deploying them and being caught. But if enabled, there could be a lot of potential out there to get people to actually do things that are very, very interesting.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, it's not going to be easy, it's not going to be straightforward. The reason why we normally would be better at using Gen AI in particular than our students is because we've grown up without it. So for us, it's just another tool, and we can apply the higher level thinking skills that we've developed without it to it. But if we allow our students to use Gen AI without any restrictions, without knowledge, then we risk them not getting to that level that we need. So it is difficult. And in a minute, we'll have a look at some ways of doing it.
Right, we've just got a question online. Someone's asking, do we have or are we planning workshops for students to teach them how to document and acknowledge their use of AI? Could it become part of academic integrity modules? There is referencing guidelines, aren't there?
There are, but and this is just my opinion. I've had a look, and I've sort of half started working on something to do with credit, but I think that it is the area that's missing. It's a clear taxonomy. It's a clear demarcation of what the different activities are that we can use Gen AI for, and that's one way I think of, how should I put it, decriminalising a lot of it. Because, yeah, I think some of our students think any use of Gen AI, and it's our staff as well, think any use of Gen AI is not permitted. But we all know there are gradations of use and there are types of use.
But it adds to that point about assessments, is that we need to start having a fundamental rethink of what we're assessing and how we're crediting it. And then that has to feed back into the processes and the education and everything else that we're doing. It's fundamentally rethinking the university experience and what we're grading and what we're teaching. And we're halfway there. We're doing a lot of skills stuff. We're looking at skills and how skills are developed. And we're beginning to focus towards looking towards developing skills within assessments. So we're getting away from the whole process of regurgitating references and knowledge. So we're getting away from that. But it's whether we as organisations and institutions are willing to actually steer that train coming down the track list. Because assessment needs to be rethinking, and then you can build a policy around how you actually put teach students how to deal with the AI. In that respect, you don't have an endpoint to get to, you don't have a vision to get to. So you need to think about how the assessments work and what you're assessing before we start going down that track.
And it challenges massification as well.
It does.
And I think, you can't, you can set 1,000 students an essay title and you can feasibly mark it, but you can't do that if you're checking how they speak and contribute to class.
Yes, and AI can help us with that. But I was sort of thinking while you were talking, how would I sort of... Oh, sorry, yes. You've been waiting for...
I've finished, but I've got a question that's kind of related but not directly connected.
Caroline and I were chatting just before we came in here, and we weren't complaining, but we were just saying, look, we're up to here. And I said that my problem is that I keep on getting stuff dumped on me short term, or late with short deadlines, and I work like buggery to try and get it done. And as soon as I've finished it, they say, oh, but you haven't done that bit. And I'm saying, but you didn't tell me I was supposed to do that. If I'd known I was supposed to do that, I would have done that in the first place, and it would have been easier for me. And I think that's where we are with Gen AI. We don't know what we need to do. And we don't know what we need to tell our students to do so that we can get it, if not right, certainly make progress. And what I'm trying to do today, hopefully, is just to give you some guidelines of this is what I think, based on my experience and my reading, we need to do. Now, it's almost certainly going to change for you in your different disciplines, but I hope anyway, that I'm roughly there, at least the main bits. So that's sort of what this is really. You've been waiting very patiently, thank you.
No, I just want to rewind one slide.
Yeah.
I just feel like I've missed something that seems quite important. It feels like invasion of the cyborgs, and I'd just like to clarify what is a BCI?
Brain-computer interfaces. So did you see in the papers the other day, they've had somebody with a chip in their brain, and they've linked it to an artificial arm, and that artificial arm now can thread a needle. Yeah. So it's the neural implants that are now interfacing to I'm using the word bionic because I watched Steve, a $6 million man. But essentially that's what it is electronic prosthetics.
So how does that relate to the theme of AI in higher education? And I'm sorry, I just lost that little chunk there.
Well, these are new technologies that are coming on board. So it might not be in social sciences, but it would be in social sciences. I was recently looking at some work, and they've they're proposing that it's for, I do work on technology acceptance, and I've done some work on the technology acceptance model. And one of the criticisms of it is that it relies too much on self-reporting. So people saying, I did this. And so the data are biased because we know that people think of things differently. Well, I don't need to tell you anyway. One of the proposed new data collection techniques is neurotechnology or neuroinformation systems, where we get people and we say, and we measure what they're doing, but we use it with brain, what are they called? What are those things that you stick the...
Electrodes.
That's it, yeah. So that we're looking at neural activity to see what people are doing when they're doing certain cognitive tasks. So rather than rely on qualitative self-reporting, what we have got is quantitative, measurable data coming through, which then allows us to look at things in different ways, to collect our different kinds of data, to triangulate. And this is something that it's not too old, but it's not too new either. But it is, I think, now becoming a new area where social scientists, before it was neuroscientists, now social scientists are beginning to expand this. So why is that important? Because as soon as we have data, as soon as we have quantitative data, we can stick it into AI. So it is a little bit of a side sort of, but that's what I sort of meant by that. Well, that's what I think that's how I interpret what she means by that. Does that answer?
So we must be able to imagine a future that's not too distant when we will have implants and data chips and things. I mean, moving from a wearable piece of technology connected to your body, functions is not a big leap from something we'll be scanning and doing stuff, or maybe we'll even be assessed by someone monitoring our brain waves or whatever. We don't know.
Well, actually, I hadn't thought about that, but that's quite interesting.
For those of a certain age, it's like a Joe 90 helmet. You no longer have to lecture and deliver knowledge. It can be delivered straight into the brain.
Yeah.
I mean, we might think that it's science fiction now, but it's probably not too far off.
There was an article in The Guardian on Saturday about it. He was a guy who was, I think, quadriplegic, and Elon Musk has his engineers have put a chip in his brain and is changing the capabilities of what he can do. So at the moment, they're working to overcome disability, but, it can be taken beyond there over time.
It's been an idea that's been around in sci-fi for a very long time. So, it's something, because the thing with these tech nerds is they read the sci-fi and they think it's really cool, but they don't actually think about the ethics. So the joke is that, the sci-fi says the torture chamber is really bad, and they go and say, oh, look, I made a new torture chamber. That's how the tech nerds kind of work on this. But it's been an idea for a very long time. The issues start becoming, where is it going to be implemented? Is it going to be part of a working environment? The sociology of work that comes with that, the ethics, the willingness, there'd be a huge question about prison labour, will it be enforced, work like that. So all of the really explored in sci-fi, but getting pretty much close to how it, for us, sort of scientists, how it works at work, the ethics of it, the enforcement of it, the privacy levels, all those kind of questions are coming for us.
So I think what I was and I think I have succeeded in terms of what I wanted, is put this up to provoke a discussion and make you realise that the technology is there that is going to disrupt us, that is going to have an impact. Sorry.
This might be very provocative, but I can't help thinking, what would Bob Dylan say? Right, having recently watched his...
He wouldn't be impressed.
Having recently watched his film, but this, I go along with most of what you're saying. I think there's huge opportunities here. I think we have to go into that in many different ways. But in terms of the idea of enhancing human creativity, I mean, surely not for everyone, right? It's like, can it write poetry? I mean, does AI have an unconscious? Does it have an imagination? I mean, these kind of things. that, the basis of real kind of human creativity, poetry, sort of creative writing, these kind of things. I mean, how can AI really do that?
Well, they did a test where AI wrote a poem and poets wrote poems for the general public, and the AI version actually was perceived as better. Not to burst that bubble, but it judges more the general public around the understanding of poetry, I would argue.
You said a lot more about poetry than
So a couple of other things. Firstly, I don't know if you've heard of this, TESCA, which is the Australian equivalent of QAA. I do a lot of work with Australians, and they are, what do they say? They're terrified of it. Okay? So TESCA have said, look, here are the principles of working with generative AI. You can see it's not the original document, but it's a summary of it, or it's an advice document. And what they're saying is that they are already having to integrate into their practice these things, okay, which is, I think, what some of you are already sort of worried about. And they're saying this is what the action you should take. No, you could, but it's being interpreted as should take. And these are the things that they are finding difficult to integrate into their assessment. So Australia, they do seem to be a little bit ahead of us in terms of integration of technology and specifically integration of Gen AI. So this is one potential environment where we may be faced with working within quite soon. I'm not sure how we avoid it, but I'm just sort of painting the picture almost that this is what's happening the other side of the globe. And because of the closeness between the two education systems, it's possible, maybe probable, that we might be looking at something similar coming through too.
Jane, you already are, aren't you?
What?
You're already doing that.
Yeah.
Your assessments.
Yeah, so we mandate that they use AI, but interestingly, they're still terrified of it. Even though we've asked them to use AI, they're like, oh, can we really? And then we ask them to include their prompts, and looking at their assessments now, some of these prompts are really vague, or that they haven't gone into depth with them. So it's quite surprising, even though we've mandated it, they're like, they're
And
still...
they haven't done brilliant essays either.
No, they haven't. You'd expect it to be immaculate when you sort of ask them to write a report using AI. And then...
I think the difference is the Australians are telling me that this almost is a mandate, even though it's supposed to be guidelines. It's been interpreted by the universities in Australia's governance as this is what should happen, as opposed to, these were here to help you out. Now, I'm not going to do too much with these two slides. I'm going to skip through them, but the main point of this was to say authentic assessment is one way that we can look at. And here was almost a taxonomy of different authentic assessments, which I think some of, they've been mentioned before. But I have 3 case studies to show you, to sort of help maybe understand how I and people I know have integrated Gen AI. I'm not saying they're perfect, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it might help to see what other people have done. So I looked at the answers from last week in terms of the Padlet, and these were the kind of things that people were saying. Never used it, support and planning, translation. But aside from this one comment, summative assessments, we were mostly avoiding it for our assessments. So hence, case studies. So I use synthetic data a lot in my assessments. Any of you who do a data analytics, you'll know that Kaggle is a repository of data sets. I mined out Kaggle a long time ago for data sets. And in data analytics, in machine learning, we need data sets. So I generate them synthetically, and I find that it's really good. Now, you might be thinking, I'm social science here, I'm SBS, how's that going to help me? Because if we can generate data synthetically, we can also generate text synthetically. That's what large language models do. It saves time, it's flexible, and this is an easy transition. This doesn't require us to rewrite our assessment rules. And what I've found is that certainly for data, I haven't seen any compromises in terms of my learning outcomes, in terms of the students' learning experience. And it now gives me more time, more flexibility. So I'm not going to go into detail because I don't have time, but it's there for you. But what I will show you is, this was the assessment, right? So it's still a computer science assessment, and it's not one of mine, but I just did this morning. Okay? And I did it in about 10 minutes, honestly. I'm not sort of trying to play it up. So I took the scenario that the other lecturer had created, and I know from experience that takes ages to think these up. And that's the detail of the scenario. There's a lot of it. And it took me 5 minutes, and then I sort of, I updated it a little bit. And look at what I got. Okay, that was a prompt, I just stuck it in. And I have got this. And you can take it from me, it's good.
And this is particularly useful for us because I was told this year that we don't have any resources to buy case studies. So trying to find ones that are free, being able to generate one might be our solution to our financial situation.
So this one, it came out with, in fact, I got two, but the first one, something happened on my network and it crashed halfway through. So then I got a second one. Both times they gave me different industries for the scenario. And the detail, I have to go through this. I have to make sure it's right, but that saved me hours.
So you just used the same prompt engineering principles that you
I just stuck
did
it in.
last time?
Yeah.
You know, like when you,
Yeah. And in fact, this I didn't even go very deeply because you can see the detail that I got from a single prompt, which is just simply cut and paste. And I said to it, give me an alternative scenario to this.
How do we then reconcile that with the fact that students are doing that for their assessments? If we say, look how much time this saves, look how accurate it is, and the reason that we know that they're doing it is because they don't then do the check. So the worst case, I've been really fighting back saying this because it makes me really upset. I've been at work where the student has claimed to have done a qualitative research study and has AI generated the interviews, and we're just not tackling that. We're just not engaging with that.
We're not.
And if we're saying we can invent data to show them to use and generate, how do we then separate that from, but when you do your assignment, you have to go and do a case study, you have to go and do research interviews, you have to do a survey. But look how easily I can invent a survey data which we can then practice analysing, we can practice the maths, we can practice the thematic analysis without ever leaving our bedroom and speaking to a human being.
The idea is that we need to change from assessing the output to assessing the process and reflections and getting them to report on what they did. So doing the higher level thinking skills, focusing more on what were you doing to analyse this? How did you evaluate it? And we're assuming...
Still, if we're just training researchers, but you don't actually have to do a research interview, I can't live with that.
It's not going to be perfect. There are certain areas where it's not right. And the AI assessment scale will say that it's perfectly acceptable for certain assessments to say, no, AI is not permitted here. But again, that's easier said than done. Because somebody asked me last week, how do you detect AI when you're editing, when you're an editor accepting papers for your journal? And I said, well, at the moment, what we're doing is we're looking at the references and we're checking the references to see that they're not made up. But I know that if anyone is not stupid, they can get around that.
Well, and it's... It doesn't
does draw on real.
And it can do. You can feed it Google Scholar lists and say, draw from these references.
But you don't even need to do that. So I tested it to make sure that I wasn't being, wasn't suspecting students who weren't. I can put in the research questions that I look at. There's a completely plausible one.
Yeah.
And I don't have to read a single paper.
Yeah, and it's hard. It is hard. And the AI detection as well is, it's, I wouldn't say it's ineffective, but it's not as effective as they claim it to be. And so we can't do anything about it, so we have to now go, how do we deal with it? How do we incorporate this, and how do we still enable our students to learn?
I think that's the thing, yeah. That's my issue with the creativity. It'd be really possible to pass your dissertation.
Yeah, I don't think it's creative. Yeah, I don't think it's. I think it's creative to a certain level, but I don't think it's creative. And I agree with you completely. I don't think it's creative in terms of. That's where the enhancement comes in. But that's my first example to show you, for us anyway, and it is a double-edged sword. For us, this is an area where it can be incorporated into our assessment practice very, very simply without too much disruption.
Mike, it might come up in the conversations. Our next example to come on the chat about how do we, just to quote it, really concerned about critical thinking here. I guess that's what Fabian's getting at, and put words in his mouth, is how do we ensure that students develop those skills?
Yeah. Hopefully the next couple of examples might help. So the second one is what I have done before, and what I did was I released my assignment, I stuck it through ChatGPT, and the week after I released my assignment, in my class I said, this is what ChatGPT has answered. Now you have to provide me with something better if you're going to pass this. And what I focused on were higher order thinking skills. So I wanted students to tell me what their process was. I wanted students to justify each option they made. I wanted them to evaluate the potential options. I wanted them to reflect on what they had done. And so that's what I was, for one part of the assessment, that's what I was focusing, rather than the output, which was a specification for a database. And I felt that I was justified in doing that because we'd done it in class. And if the students had paid attention, then they could have done that. And if they hadn't, then ChatGPT, they'd have to then read it to understand what the process was. So this is one example where I've now changed what I was assessing, or the way that I was assessing. I'm still assessing the same things, but I'm changing in terms of what the emphasis is and what I want them to do. And it's focusing more on their cognitive understanding of the process and what they should do to create a good output, rather than what the output is. And after some grumbling, it went quite well. And this next example is not mine, from a colleague of mine who's a language lecturer. And what she had done is, it was a two-part assessment, and for part one, she explicitly asked them to use GenAI to create responses to certain questions. And then they were required to evaluate them. And as an example for part two, she expressly forbade GenAI. I didn't ask her whether, how confident she was that that didn't happen, but that was the idea. And the thing she was doing was she was asking these sort of questions. She was saying to them, ask these questions, and that's what the first part of the assessment is. Was it correct? So I'm pretty certain, in speaking for her, what she was wanting them to do was undergo some kind of validation of the output. Okay? Then evaluate it. then analyse it in certain ways, and then to put their own view on it. So that's sort of very quickly the third case study that I sort of present to you. So I'm hoping that the last two you can see we changed what we did for assessment. Still, in my, certainly, and I don't know about this one, but in my one, my learning outcomes were not altered, but my assessment process was. So I think, have we still got time, Caroline, to do the workshop?
We've got 20 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So what I thought I would do now is, for the next bit, we have Padlets, and I thought I'd like to now ask you to sort of think about how, what we've sort of looked at today, how you might incorporate it, or what you think feedback on terms of how it might sort of impact you. But before I sort of, are there any questions? And does it make sense? It does, yeah. So yes, you had a...
Just thinking about this from the point of a skills advisor, it seems to me that whatever we do with students, I mean, we still need to aim at those higher level skills. And it just seems to me that for those who are already, let's say, more mature, doing better, they'll be able to integrate AI and use it to their advantage, perhaps to enhance their learning process. For those who don't, it will almost widen the gap, it seems to me. And then, okay, what do we do then, you know what I mean? Because they won't know, okay, how to use AI, how to use it critically, what are its weaknesses, strengths, all of it, you know, giving prompts that are specific enough, whereas the sort of students who are sort of a bit higher level will be able to do that, so it just creates another problem in that sense.
There's two sort of things I would sort of say to that. Firstly is that there is another bit that I haven't talked about yet, and hopefully I don't mind me blowing my trumpet, but I just got a QAA grant to look at graduate attributes in the era of Gen AI. And that's the next bit, I think, the bit that goes on for it. I think we need to revisit our graduate attributes, and I think our graduate attributes need to now take account of the fact that the workplace, the environment, has changed significantly from when most of our graduate attributes were developed, which is 10 years ago. And so if we have that element in place as well, yet another element, but that element in place, then I think it helps you, it helps us then focus on what's important. Because if we don't get our graduates to have these skills, firstly, they're disadvantaged. Secondly, industry, whether it's in our country or whether it's in the country where the graduates are going to, is also disadvantaged because we've got a skills shortage. And whether we like it or not, those skills are required now for Industry 4 and in the future for Industry 5, which is really what we should be looking at as opposed to just automating everything. So that would be my answer to it. There's another bit that also is sort of the, I guess, the macro level. You had
I just wanted to echo that, because the fear that I would have with those assessments that you've shown as case studies 2 and 3 is that if they ought to be done really well by a student, it requires a depth of knowledge, thinking about my own assessments and my modules, a breadth of knowledge as well in the relevant theoretical concepts in stuff that has been written over decades in this area to do this kind of critique really well. Whereas in a more traditional essay, a student who has a fairly solid grasp of the core readings would still be able to get, I don't know, 58, perhaps even 62 if they apply themselves really well to that. And that would be my major concern with this as well, that if you take away that opportunity to deploy and apply their knowledge in a meaningful way to a case study by giving this kind of high-level task where they have to profoundly critique the output from ChatGPT, that level of marks is very, very difficult to achieve.
We do. We have a gradient of assessments And we do have to build our students up to be able to be capable of this. And one of the problems is that because it's so readily available and so easily available, that we do run the risk of students becoming too reliant upon it. And I think that's one of the big questions we have to address. How do we assess when we want to explicitly forbid the use of generative AI? And I know the gut reaction is we go to exams. Right? But maybe sometimes in certain circumstances we might have to do that. We don't do it across the board, but maybe in certain circumstances we might have to do a time-constrained assessment just to make sure that students do develop those skills. Just like they have in GCSE maths, they have 2 papers. They have non-calculator and calculator. And I think we also have to have a range of assessments where some of them it's perfectly acceptable, and not just perfectly acceptable, but it is very important for the learning of our students for us to say, no, you cannot use generative AI. You need to be able to develop these skills. We have this issue with computer science because it's so easy to code. And I'll freely hold my hand up and say, I'm a lazy bastard. And I don't want to spend hours learning a new or developing a new function when I can do it in 30 seconds. But I can do it in 30 seconds because I know how to code. And I know immediately, no, that's not what I want. I can correct that. But if I didn't, I wouldn't understand. I wouldn't be able to use it properly. So yeah, we have to have the whole range, and it's up to us as a body of educators to figure out how we do this, because it's still at a very, very early stage.
I think my problem with it is that something like, skill of learning how to write a persuasive argument, it just is not something that you can just give someone one assessment on and then they nail that and then you can do something else the next time. It's a process that will take at least 3 years and actually probably a lifetime to get better and better at sort of expressing yourself in writing.
Yeah, but it's what we do anyway, isn't it? In first year, we do focus on analysis and evaluation, but it's less important than doing it's not the grunt stuff, but it's the foundational stuff. Second year, we move on a little bit more, and third year, we push them, and then masters, we actually say, no, this is really what you want. We don't want bookwork from you. And I think we have to now realize that we're doing that, we're still doing it, but in a different way and with a different context. Sorry, everybody, if I can just draw things to a close. So I've just only in 2 minutes had a look at the Padlets, but I think they make interesting reading just to finish things off. So how might we adjust? Well, I'm glad to see that's at the start. At least one person was listening to me. But I really do think...
Good question, because surely they can ask AI to do the reflection. I mean, both colleagues here have got examples of where that's happened, so it feels like that doesn't necessarily...
They're not very good reflections.
It's a moving goalpost as well, because it does get better and better, even in the last year or so. But yeah, I agree with you. I
don't think they're very good. And I get them to submit a learning log, so where they're logging their learning every week and then referencing that in the reflective statements. And I'm sure you could put the log into AI, but they're not very...
No, I agree with you.
It's not very personalised.
The way I sort of characterise it, as I say, I think it's like an 11 or a 12-year-old. So it doesn't exhibit that spark. It doesn't exhibit that sort of higher order reflection. It doesn't sort of show that they are really, truly reflecting in depth. So I think that at the moment we still can differentiate, and there still is something for us to add when we ask our students to reflect. That's my opinion. 6 months' time. Yeah. Formative feedback. Yeah, I think it's good for formative feedback because it's quick, and what our students want is quick. But again, we don't use it unthinkingly, and we don't use it without verifying it. We don't use it without evaluating it, and we don't use it without adding our own value added to it. And yes, people have said we need to see students in person or presenting via voce. I talked with the group at the end about international students where English is not their foreign language, but we can now get AI-generated voices where they can present with that, and anecdotally, what I hear is that then does make the barrier seem less high. So in terms of obstacles, the theme there is AI literacy for staff and students. And I think Caroline and Nadine, by starting this off, because I don't know anywhere else in the university that's doing it, I think they're at the forefront of recognizing this and doing something about it. And then impact. Yeah, focus again on processes, and it's on assessment. I think the biggest impact on us is going to be on assessments. The delivery, those are things that we will adapt in our own way and at our own speed, but I don't think we have the luxury of not taking account of it in assessments. I think that's something that's like COVID-19 is forced on us. So, yeah, so that's me finished. The last thing I just wanted to say is I hope I've got across fate and post-plagiarism world. And thank you all for listening to me.
I'm sorry for rushing you off. After my first teaching experience being abused by a little man via email for being late, leaving a room, I've been always scarred for that ever since, and I always want to leave on time, so I'm a bit paranoid about it. So just to close, I hope you found the session helpful. I know I certainly have. I was going to, in the next session, just want to give a little bit detail about the next sessions. Just a quick reminder, we're kind of going through Helia's model. The next thing we're looking at is through a marketing lens. We're looking at employer perspectives. So Nadine and some of the colleagues from the marketing team have got guest speakers in who'll talk about kind of student graduate attributes, thinking about what they're looking for in terms of in the workplace. Nadine will tell you more, she's shaking her head at me.
Yeah, so basically we have someone locally coming in, and she's going to show the students how to use generative AI, how she's using it in her business on a daily, day-to-day basis, just to give students more a practical angle, because I wouldn't know what software is up to date or what to do with it. So she's going to come in and really going to talk about how they're using it in the company. So she's running a marketing consultancy, and she's going to talk about the pros and cons and how long prompts actually need to be to give her a decent output. Because as some people have already said, using prompts and assessments, the outputs are questionable at best at the moment. But so she's going to talk more from a practical angle to kind of give us how the industry is maybe perceiving that, just to give you guys a heads up of what to expect.
Yeah, so whilst it's focused on marketing, I think there's lots, it's transferable, so don't think because you're not in that area it's not applicable. Everybody is welcome and it is relevant to everybody. So thank you very much. Thanks from myself, Nadine, and thank you again to Mike for giving his time so generously over the last 2 sessions. It really is appreciated.
No, I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.